The auction block stood weathered and stained beneath the merciless Colorado sun, its rough-hewn planks bearing witness to countless transactions that had reduced dignity to commerce. The wood had darkened over years of use soaked through with the sweat of fear and the tears of the powerless. It sat in the center of Blackwood Gulch like a throne of shame, elevated 3 feet above the dirt street so that all could see what was being sold. Sister Catherine Hayes stood upon those planks, now her white habit torn at the shoulder, where rough hands had grabbed her during the long journey from St. Mary's Mission. The fabric, once pristine as fresh snow, now bore the stains of 3 weeks running through wilderness, 3 weeks of terror and determination mixed in equal measure. Her hands clutched baby Grace against her chest, feeling the infant's rapid heartbeat against her own racing pulse. The child was too quiet, too still. 8 months old, and already she had learned that silence meant survival. The crowd gathered below numbered perhaps 40 men. Miners, mostly their faces burnt dark by the high-altitude sun, their hands calloused from working claims that rarely paid out. There were gamblers, too, their soft hands and calculating eyes, marking them as predators of a different sort. Drifters, ranch hands, men who had come to the frontier seeking fortune or fleeing justice and found instead only the hard truth that civilization's rules grew thin in the mountains. They looked up at Catherine with eyes that made her skin crawl. Some saw a commodity, others saw entertainment. A few perhaps saw the wrongness of what was happening, but lacked the courage to speak against it. The auction block had a way of silencing decent impulses, turning witnesses into accomplices through their very presence. The auctioneer stood beside her, a man whose teeth were stained the color of tobacco juice, whose breath reeked of whiskey even at midday. His eyes held no more compassion than the stones beneath their feet. He had sold cattle and horses and mining equipment from this same block. Adding a woman and child to his inventory troubled him not at all. "Gentlemen," his voice cut through the afternoon heat like a blade. "A rare offering today, a nun from St. Mary's Mission and an orphan baby." The crowd stirred, interest peaked. A nun, that was unusual. That was exotic, worth more than the average for frontier woman who knew how to cook and clean and keep her mouth shut. The good sister here volunteered herself, the auctioneer continued, and Catherine felt rage flash through her fear. Volunteered. As if she had chosen this freely, as if there had been any real choice when Blackjack Wilson held a gun to Hannah Miller's head and an infant in his other arm. "Ain't that charitable of her?" The crowd jeered. One man, gap-toothed and grinning, called out, "What's a nun good for anyway?" His companions laughed, their suggestions growing cruder by the moment. Catherine forced herself to keep her eyes fixed on the mountains in the distance, those snow-capped peaks that promised escape if only she could reach them. She prayed silently, her lips moving around familiar words that suddenly felt hollow. The rosary beads wrapped around her wrist dug into her skin, a small pain to anchor her against the larger terror. Baby Grace stirred in her arms, beginning to fuss. Catherine shifted her grip, trying to soothe the child without drawing more attention. The baby was hungry. They were both hungry. Blackjack had given them little food during the journey, just enough to keep them alive and valuable. Grace's face had grown gaunt, her cheeks no longer round with infant health. It broke Catherine's heart to see how this innocent child had suffered for the sins of desperate adults. "Let's start the bidding at $30, the auctioneer announced. His gavel rapped against the podium, a sound like a judge's sentence. "30 for the pair. Who'll give me 30, Mom?" A hand went up, then another. The numbers climbed with casual cruelty. 40, 50, 60. Catherine felt the world tilt beneath her feet with each new bid, each new voice determining her fate. These men were haggling over human lives with less consideration than they would give to buying a horse. At least with a horse, they would check its teeth and legs first. $75. The bidding slowed. Catherine dared to look down at the crowd, searching their faces for some hint of mercy. She saw none, just calculation lust, or worse, simple indifference. To most of them, she was already invisible. Just another transaction in a day full of buying and selling. $100. A skinny man with a scar across his nose made the bid, his eyes never leaving Catherine's face. She recognized that look. She had seen it before in the faces of the men who had attacked the mission, who had dragged her and Hannah and Sister Margaret from their beds in the dark of night. It was the look of a man who saw women as objects to be used and discarded. 100, the auctioneer crowed. Do I hear 110, 100 going once? Catherine's knees threatened to buckle. She held Grace tighter, the baby's small weight, the only real thing in a world that had become nightmare. Her mind raced through possibilities of escape. If she ran now, they would catch her before she made it 10 feet. If she fought, they would overpower her and likely hurt Grace in the process. She was trapped by biology and circumstance, by the simple fact that she was a woman alone among men who had forgotten how to see her as human. 125, a new voice thick with drink even this early in the day. The auctioneer's eyes gleamed. This was turning into a better sale than he had anticipated. 125, I have 125. Who'll give me 150? Catherine closed her eyes, prayed harder. The words came automatically learned by rote during 8 years in the convent. Hail Mary, full of grace. The Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. But God felt very far away from this dusty Colorado street, from this block where humans were sold like cattle. If he was watching, he gave no sign. A hand touched her arm. The auctioneer's assistant, a boy no more than 16, who could not meet her eyes. He steadied her when she swayed his grip gentle despite the circumstances. Perhaps there was still some decency left in the world after all. Small mercies. Going once for 125 OM, the auctioneer raised his gavel. The crowd leaned forward, eager to see the conclusion of this particular entertainment. Baby Grace began to cry in earnest now, a thin wail that seemed to echo off the surrounding buildings and mountains beyond. The sound cut through Catherine's prayers, through her fear, straight to her heart. This child, this innocent. For her, Catherine had traded her own freedom. For her and for Hannah, the young mother who had deserved better than to be stolen from her home and threatened with horrors worse than death. Going twice, the crowd held its breath. Time seemed to slow. Catherine could see dust motes dancing in the sunlight, could hear the distant sound of a smithy's hammer of chickens scratching in an alley of horses shifting in their traces. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon in which something extraordinary and terrible was happening. Then from the back of the crowd, a voice cut through the suspended moment with absolute authority. $200. The words fell like stones into still water, rippling outward in waves of shock. The crowd turned as one head swiveling to see who had spoken. The auctioneer's jaw literally dropped, his gavel frozen in midair. $200, more than double the current bid, more than a good horse, more than a season's worth of supplies. It was a fortune for a nun and a baby, an absurd amount that made no economic sense whatsoever. Catherine's eyes found the speaker. He stood at the edge of the crowd, having just emerged from between two buildings, as if summoned by her desperate prayers. Tall, perhaps 6 feet and more, with shoulders broad enough to block the sun. His beard was dark and full, his face weathered by years of mountain living. He wore the practical clothes of a mountain man, buckskin and wool-patched and repaired but clean. A rifle hung loosely in his left hand, not threatening but present. His eyes, deep brown and steady, fixed not on the auctioneer, but on Catherine herself. Something in his expression made her breath catch. Not cruelty, not lust, not even pity, which would have been its own kind of insult. Just a recognition of shared humanity, a quiet acknowledgement that what was happening here was wrong and that he at least would do something about it. Did you say 200? The auctioneer had recovered enough to speak, though his voice still held disbelief. You deaf? The mountain man's voice was calm, matter of fact. 200K, right now, sold or not. The crowd parted before him as he walked forward, men stepping aside without quite knowing why. He moved with the confidence of someone completely at ease in his own skin, someone who had faced down worse threats than a crowd of miners and gamblers. His hand went to a leather pouch at his belt, and Catherine heard the soft clink of coins. Real money. Not promises or credit. Cold, hard gold that spoke louder than any words. The auctioneer licked his lips, greed warring with confusion. Any other bids? Anyone want to top 200 for the sister and child? Silence. The man who had bid 125 shook his head and stepped back clearly, unwilling to compete with someone who threw money around like that. The others in the crowd shuffled their feet, disappointed that the entertainment was ending, but unwilling to part with that kind of cash. Going once for 200. The auctioneer's gavel hand trembled slightly. Going twice. A pause, giving anyone a last chance to jump in. Sold to the gentleman for $200. The mountain man stepped up to the auction block already counting out coins from his pouch. Gold pieces, each one representing weeks of trapping and hunting and hard living. Catherine watched him lay them into the auctioneer's palm with deliberate precision, each piece falling with a soft clink that sealed her fate. This was really happening. She had been sold. Her freedom, her dignity, her very self reduced to a mathematical equation that totaled $200. The auctioneer bit one of the coins, testing it, then nodded satisfied. Pleasure doing business. She's all yours, mister. All yours. The words hung in the air like a curse. Catherine felt her stomach turn over. She had no idea who this man was or what he wanted with her. His expressionless face gave away nothing. Mountain men had a reputation. Stories told around mission fires spoke of wild men who lived alone in the high country, more animal than human, following no law but their own appetites. She had just been purchased by a stranger who could do whatever he wanted with her, and no one would stop him. But when he approached the platform, when he extended his hand to help her down from the block, she saw something in his eyes that made her hesitate only a moment before accepting. His palm was rough with calluses, the hand of a man who worked with his body every day. But it was steady, warm, and when his fingers closed gently around hers, there was no grabbing, no crushing grip, just support as she stepped down, clutching baby Grace against her chest. Ma'am, his voice was quiet, meant only for her. You're free now. Free. Catherine wanted to laugh at the word. Free. She belonged to him now, bought and paid for like a sack of flour. What kind of freedom was that? But when she met his eyes at close range, when she saw the absolute sincerity there, she found herself asking in a whisper, Free, I belong to God, sir. Now I belong to you. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes. No, ma'am, you belong to yourself, baby too. I just paid for the privilege of making sure of that. Before Catherine could process those words, before she could ask what he meant, or who he was, or what he wanted, he was already turning away, gesturing for her to follow. The crowd parted again, men staring after them with expressions ranging from confusion to disappointment. She heard muttering as they passed, waste of money, fool and his gold, wonder what he wants with a nun. The speculation would only get cruder once they were out of earshot. Baby Grace had quieted in Catherine's arms, perhaps sensing the change in circumstances, or perhaps simply too exhausted to cry anymore. Catherine followed her purchaser through the dusty streets of Blackwood Gulch, acutely aware of every eye upon them. Women peered from windows. Children stopped their play to stare. This was a story that would be told and retold in the saloons tonight, growing stranger with each telling. The man led her to where two horses stood tied to a hitching post. One was a sturdy bay gelding, clearly his mount. The other was a gray mare with kind eyes, saddled but unburdened. He gestured to the mare. You can ride. Yes. Catherine's father had taught her as a girl back in Boston, when life had been so different that it might as well have been another world. But where are you taking us? My cabin, 8 miles north up in the high country. You'll be safe there. Safe. That word again. Catherine studied his profile as he untied the horses, trying to read intention in the set of his jaw, the line of his shoulders. He moved with economy, no wasted motion, every action purposeful. A man used to doing things himself, to relying on no one but his own skills and strength. Why did you do this? The question burst from her before she could stop it. Bias, you don't know me. You don't owe me anything. He paused in the act of checking the mare's girth, his hands stilling on the leather. For a long moment he did not answer, and Catherine thought perhaps he would nod. Then, without looking at her, he said simply, seemed wrong. What they were doing to you, treating you like cattle to be sold. No woman should face that, especially not with a child. His words carried conviction, but no expectation of gratitude, as if he had simply done what any decent person would do, as if $200 was a small price to pay for another human being's dignity. Catherine felt something shift in her chest, some small warming against the ice of fear that had gripped her for weeks. But you don't know me, she repeated, needing to understand. I could be anyone, could have done anything. Why risk your money and your safety for strangers? This time he did look at her, and she saw depths in his eyes that spoke of old wounds and older wisdom. I know what it is to be alone and afraid. I know what it means to have nowhere to turn when the world decides you don't matter. The weight of personal experience sat heavy in those words. Catherine realized that this man, this stranger who had just upended his life for her, understood something of what she had endured. Not the specifics, perhaps, but the essence, the terror of powerlessness, the desperation of being at the mercy of those who had none. He helped her mount the mare, his hands careful and respectful, as he steadied her until she found her seat with Grace still in her arms. The baby had fallen into an exhausted sleep, her small face peaceful for the first time in weeks. Catherine settled the infant more securely against her chest, making sure the blanket protected her from the sun. "What's your name?" Catherine asked, as her rescuer swung onto his own mount. "Caleb Mitchell." "I'm Sister Catherine Hayes, and this is Grace." "Sister." He acknowledged the title with a nod, then clicked his tongue and his bay started forward at a walk. Catherine's mare followed without prompting. They left Blackwood Gulch behind, riding north towards the mountains that had watched over the day's ugly business with the same indifference they had witnessed 1,000 other human dramas. The trail wound upward, almost immediately climbing away from the valley floor into foothills dense with pine and aspen. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, painting everything gold and green. Birds sang in the branches. A squirrel chattered at them from a high perch. Normal sounds of a normal forest, so at odds with the abnormal circumstances that had brought Catherine to this moment. She studied Caleb Mitchell's back as he rode ahead, noting details. The way he sat his horse with casual ease, as comfortable in the saddle as most men were in a chair. The way his head turned slightly at every sound, constantly aware of his surroundings. The rifle in its scabbard worn but well maintained. This was a man who lived his life carefully, who had learned that survival in the mountains required constant vigilance. "You're a soldier," Catherine said, after they had ridden perhaps a mile. It was not a question. She recognized the signs, had seen them often enough, in the men her father had treated during and after the war. "I can tell by how you move." Caleb glanced back at her, surprise flickering across his features. "Was, long time ago. Union or Confederate? Union. You, Boston, born and raised. My father was a Union surgeon. The first real connection between them that shared history of a war that had torn the nation apart and still cast shadows more than a decade after its end." Something in Caleb's posture relaxed fractionally. At least she was not the enemy's daughter. At least they had that much common ground. They rode in silence for another mile, the trail growing steeper. Catherine's arms began to ache from holding Grace, from the constant balancing act of keeping the baby secure while staying seated on a moving horse. She shifted her grip, trying to find a more comfortable position. "How far?" she asked. "6 more miles. We'll reach it before dark." Before dark. Catherine looked at the sun, gauging its position. They had perhaps 3 hours of good light left. 3 hours of riding through wilderness with a man she did not know carrying a baby who depended entirely on her protection. 3 hours to wonder what waited at the end of this journey. Baby Grace woke as they crossed a narrow stream, the horse's hooves splashing through cold mountain runoff. She immediately began to cry, the thin wail of a child who had been hungry for too long. Catherine tried to soothe her, rocking, gently murmuring soft words. But the baby was beyond comfort, her small body rigid with distress. Caleb drew rein and dismounted in a single fluid motion. He approached Catherine's mare, looking up at the crying infant with an expression she could not quite read. "She's hungry." "I know, I have no milk. I've been giving her sugar water and mashed food, but..." Catherine felt helpless admitting this failure. A woman should be able to feed a baby. It was the most basic requirement of motherhood. But weeks of poor nutrition and constant stress had dried up what little milk she had managed to produce, and Grace was paying the price. "I have goat's milk," Caleb said, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "Fresh this morning. Kept it cool in my pack." Catherine stared at him. What mountain man carried fresh goat's milk on a trip to town? But Caleb was already rummaging in his saddlebag, producing a small leather flask. He uncorked it, sniffed to make sure it had not spoiled, then poured a bit into his palm to test the temperature. Satisfied, he looked up at Catherine. "May I?" She nodded, too surprised to speak. He took Grace from her arms with a gentleness that belied his rough appearance, cradling the infant in the crook of one arm, while holding the flask to her lips with his other hand. Grace latched onto it immediately, drinking with desperate hunger. Catherine watched this strange man feed her child. watched his large, calloused hands gentle on the baby's small body, and felt tears prick her eyes. When was the last time someone had shown her such simple, uncomplicated kindness? Not in 3 weeks, certainly. Perhaps not in 3 years, not since she had taken her final vows and become Sister Catherine instead of simply Catherine Hayes. How did you know, she whispered, about the milk, about what she needed? Caleb's hands stilled for just a moment, his jaw tightened. When he spoke, his voice was carefully flat, emotion locked down behind iron discipline. Had a son once. Learned what babies need. Had, past tense. Catherine understood immediately. I'm sorry. He did not respond, just continued feeding Grace until the baby drank her fill and slipped back into sleep, milk drunk and content. Only then did he hand her back to Catherine, his movements still gentle, despite whatever pain the memory had caused. They remounted and continued climbing. The sun dropped, lower shadows lengthening between the trees. Catherine wanted to ask more questions, wanted to know who Caleb Mitchell really was, what had happened to his son, why a grieving father would carry goat's milk into town. But his closed expression discouraged conversation, and she was suddenly too tired to push. The trail emerged from forest into a small meadow where wildflowers nodded in the evening breeze. Beyond it, set against a backdrop of aspens whose leaves shimmered golden green, stood a cabin. Not the crude shelter Catherine had feared, but a solid structure of hewn logs carefully built and maintained. Smoke curled from the stone chimney. A small garden plot showed neat rows of vegetables. A corral held 2 goats and a handful of chickens. This was not the dwelling of a wild man, barely clinging to civilization. This was a home. Someone lived here with intention, with care for the small details that separated existing from living. Caleb dismounted and came to help Catherine down, steadying her when her legs wobbled after the long ride. He reached for Grace, and Catherine let him take the sleeping baby, too exhausted to protest. She followed him to the cabin door on unsteady feet, every muscle in her body protesting the hours of tension and fear that had preceded this strange journey. The door swung open on leather hinges, well-oiled and silent. Caleb stood aside, gesturing for her to enter first. The courtesy of it, the simple respect of allowing her to cross the threshold under her own power, rather than being pushed or pulled, nearly undid her. Catherine stepped into the cabin and stopped, overwhelmed by what she saw. Clean. That was her first impression. The interior was clean and organized in a way that spoke of military training or simply a man who took pride in his surroundings. Handmade furniture, rough but sturdy. A stone fireplace that dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean of ashes. Shelves lined with books and supplies in neat arrangement. Everything had its place. Everything was exactly where it should be. But one thing stood out above all the rest. Near the fireplace, catching the last rays of evening sun, through the western window sat a wooden cradle. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each curve perfect, the wood polished smooth as silk. It was a work of love made by hands that had cared deeply about the child who would sleep in it. Catherine walked to the cradle as if drawn by invisible strings. She reached out to touch the edge, ran her fingers along the wood worn smooth, not by use but by careful work. This was what Caleb had made for his son. This was the cradle that should have rocked a living child to sleep every night. It's beautiful, she whispered, her throat tight. Behind her, Caleb's voice was rough. Made it 2 winters ago. Thought someday I might have need of it. The grief in those words, the careful past, tensed the acknowledgement of hopes that had died. Catherine blinked back tears as she gently placed Grace in the cradle. The baby settled immediately, as if recognizing that this was a safe place, a place where children were meant to be. Catherine tucked the blanket around her, making sure she was warm and secure. When she turned, Caleb was watching them with an expression of such naked longing that it hurt to see. He quickly looked away, busying himself with banking the fire, but Catherine had seen. She understood now why he had carried goat's milk to town, why he had bid $200 for a nun and a baby he had never met. He had seen them on that auction block and been transported back to his own losses, to his own failures, to protect the ones he loved. He had saved them because he could not save his own family. It was penance and redemption wrapped together, purchased for the price of his winter savings. You must be hungry, Caleb said, his back still to her as he worked at the hearth. I'll make supper. Catherine watched him move around the cabin, with practiced efficiency, building up the fire, setting a pot to boil, pulling dried meat and vegetables from his stores. He worked in silence, and she did not break it. Sometimes silence was its own kind of kindness, a space where grief did not have to be explained or apologized for. The simple meal came together quickly. Venison stew with wild onions and herbs Catherine could not identify. Cornbread from a Dutch oven, still warm and fragrant. He served her a generous portion and waited until she had eaten before taking his own. Even in this, the small courtesies prevailed. He might be a mountain man living far from civilization, but he had not forgotten how to treat a guest with respect. The food was good, better than good. Catherine had not realized how hungry she was until the first bite, and then she had to force herself to eat slowly to not wolf it down like an animal. Weeks of inadequate rations had left her hollow, and her body wanted to make up the deficit all at once. "This is wonderful," she said between careful bites. "Thank you." Caleb nodded acknowledgement but did not speak. He ate methodically, eyes distant. Catherine wondered what memories he was wrestling with. What ghosts sat at this table with them, invisible but present? Grace woke as they finished eating, her small cry cutting through the cabin's quiet. Catherine moved to lift her from the cradle, but Caleb was there first, his large hands gentle, as he picked up the infant. The sight of this rough mountain man cradling her tiny charge with such care brought fresh tears to Catherine's eyes. "She needs changing," Catherine said, reaching for the baby, but Caleb had already noticed. He carried Grace to the bench near the fire where clean cloths were stacked, and with movements that spoke of experience, he tended to the baby's needs. Catherine watched in amazement. How many men knew how to properly change an infant? How many would even try? "You did this for your son," she said softly. It was not a question. "Every day for 3 months. Caleb finished his task and handed Grace back to Catherine. "Learned quick that babies don't care if you're a man or woman long as their needs are met." 3 months. His son had lived 3 months, long enough to become real, to become beloved, long enough that losing him would carve a wound that might never fully heal. "What was his name?" Catherine asked, though she feared the answer might cause pain. "Samuel." The name came out rough, as if it hurt to say. Samuel Caleb Mitchell. Born in the spring, died that same summer. And his mother, Mary, she died too, same fever. Took them both in 3 days. Caleb turned away, fussing with the fire, though it needed no attention. "That was 2 years ago." 2 years. Not so long in the grand scheme of things. Still fresh enough to wake him in the night, still raw enough that he could not look at Catherine while speaking of it. She understood grief had carried her own for 8 years now. But hers had been the loss of a future that had never happened, a life with Thomas Brennan that had ended before it truly began. Caleb's grief was for a present he had held and loved and lost, for a family that had existed and then been ripped away. "I'm sorry," Catherine said again, knowing the words were inadequate. They always were. Sorry could not resurrect the dead or heal the wounded, but it was all she had to offer. "Not your fault," Caleb said, still not looking at her. "Fever comes when it comes. Takes who it takes, no rhyme or reason to it." But Catherine heard what he did not say, that he blamed himself anyway, that he carried guilt for surviving when they had not, that every day since had been an exercise in existing without truly living and going through motions that no longer held meaning. Night had fallen fully now, the cabin's interior lit only by firelight. Shadows danced on the log walls. Outside, an owl called, hunting in the darkness. Catherine rocked Grace gently, the baby content for now, with a full belly and clean clothes. "I should sleep," Catherine said, though she was not sure where. The cabin had only one room that she could see, with a single bed built into an alcove near the fireplace. Caleb seemed to read her uncertainty. He gestured to the bed. "You take that. I'll sleep by the door." "I can't take your bed." "You can and you will. You need proper rest. The baby needs you healthy." His tone left no room for argument. "I sleep light anyway. Old habits from years of living alone in wild country. This way I can watch the door and you can rest properly." Catherine wanted to protest further, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a riptide. She had not slept more than a few hours at a time for 3 weeks, always afraid of what might happen if she let her guard down completely. The prospect of actual rest, of closing her eyes in a place that felt truly safe, was too tempting to refuse. She carried Grace to the bed, the baby already drifting back to sleep. The mattress was stuffed with what felt like pine needles and grass, dried and fragrant. Clean blankets covered it, rough woven wool that nonetheless felt like luxury compared to the bare ground she had slept on during her flight. Catherine lay down fully clothed, her habits still torn and dirty, and arranged Grace beside her where she could feel the rise and fall of the infant's breathing. Caleb was moving around the cabin, banking the fire, checking the door's heavy bar, preparing his own sleeping place near the entrance. He worked quietly, mindful of their need for rest. Catherine watched him through half-closed eyes, this stranger who had become her protector for reasons she still did not fully understand. "Mr. Mitchell," she said softly into the darkness. He paused in his preparations. "Ma'am, thank you for today, for—" She struggled to find words adequate to the magnitude of what he had done. "For seeing us, for seeing that we mattered." The silence stretched long enough that she thought perhaps he would not respond. Then his voice came through the shadows, quiet and firm. "Everyone matters, sister. Everyone deserves to be treated like they're human. That's all I did today. Treated you like you're human." Such a simple statement. Such a radical act in a world that too often reduced people to objects that measured worth in dollars and cents. Catherine felt something shift in her chest, some small crack in the armor of fear and anger she had worn for 3 weeks. This man, this Caleb Mitchell who lived alone in the mountains and carried goat's milk in case he encountered hungry infants, he understood something fundamental about human dignity that the men who had kidnapped her had forgotten. She closed her eyes, let exhaustion finally claim her. For the first time since the night Sister Margaret had shaken her awake with terror in her eyes, Catherine allowed herself to truly rest, to trust that someone else was standing watch, to believe that perhaps against all odds, she and Grace might actually survive this nightmare. In the darkness, Caleb settled onto his pallet near the door, his rifle within easy reach. He did not sleep, not fully. Old habits ran deep, and he had learned long ago that the mountains demanded vigilance. But he allowed himself to relax fractionally, to let his guard drop just enough to rest without sleeping. Outside, the Colorado night sang its ancient song. Owls hunted, coyotes called, the wind whispered through pines. And in a cabin lit by dying embers, 3 souls found temporary sanctuary. A mountain man who had lost his reason to live, a nun who had sacrificed her freedom for another, and an infant who had been saved by the desperate courage of a stranger. None of them knew that this night of peace was merely the calm before the storm. That danger rode toward them even now on horseback, following a trail gone cold, but not forgotten. That by morning they would be running for their lives into the high country, pursued by a man who believed he had a legitimate claim to what Caleb had bought. But for now, in this moment, there was only rest. Only the quiet breathing of exhausted souls taking shelter from the world's cruelty. Only the small miracle of survival in a land that did not easily grant mercy. Catherine's last conscious thought before sleep claimed her was a prayer. Not the rote words she had learned in the convent, but something simpler and more desperate. "Please God, let us have tomorrow. Let Grace live to see another dawn. Let this good man not regret his kindness." The fire burned low. The shadows deepened. And in the cradle that had been made for another child baby, Grace slept the dreamless sleep of the innocent, unaware that her life had just changed forever. Unaware that the man sleeping by the door had just become the closest thing to a father she would ever know. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own terrors. But tonight there was safety. Tonight there was rest. And sometimes in a harsh world, that was miracle enough. The peace lasted exactly 4 hours. Catherine woke to Caleb's hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm, his other hand pressed to his lips in the universal gesture for silence. The cabin was still dark, the fire reduced to glowing embers that cast barely enough light to see by. Outside, the night remained absolute, no hint of dawn touching the eastern sky. Grace stirred in her arms, but did not wake. Catherine looked up at Caleb's face, saw the tension there, and felt her heart begin to race. She mouthed a single word, "What?" He leaned close, his breath warm against her ear, voice barely a whisper. "Horses, 4, maybe 5, half-mile out, coming this way." Catherine's blood went cold. She sat up carefully, clutching Grace to her chest. Already Caleb was moving through the cabin with practiced silence, gathering supplies. Food, ammunition, blankets, everything they would need to run. He had clearly done this before, prepared for this exact scenario. A man did not live alone in the mountains without learning to plan for trouble. "How long?" Catherine whispered. 20 minutes if they come straight." Maybe 30 if they're tracking careful. Caleb paused, looked at her directly. We need to leave now. Get dressed. Warmest clothes you have. Catherine realized with a sinking feeling that she had nothing. Just the torn habit she wore the thin undergarments beneath. Everything she had owned had been left behind at the mission when Blackjack's men had dragged her from her bed. Caleb saw her expression, understood immediately. He pulled a wool shirt from a peg on the wall, handed it to her. Put this over your habit, it'll help. Already he was moving again, loading his supplies onto a pack frame with the efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times before. We'll get you proper clothes later. Right now, we just need to move. Catherine pulled on the shirt. It hung to her knees, absurdly large, but the wool was thick and warm. She wrapped Grace more securely in her blanket, made sure the baby's face was protected from the cold mountain air. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, or not only from fear, but from anger. She had been safe for 4 hours. 4 precious hours of rest, of feeling protected. And now it was being ripped away. Caleb shouldered the pack, picked up his rifle, then turned to her. Can you ride hard with the baby? I'll do what I must. Something in his expression softened at that, a flash of what might have been respect. He nodded once, sharp and decisive. Good. Stay close. Don't speak unless necessary. Sound carries in the mountains, especially at night. They slipped out the back of the cabin, moving into darkness so complete Catherine could barely see her own feet. But Caleb navigated it like daylight, his hand on her elbow, guiding her around the obstacles she could not see. The horses were already saddled, she realized. He must have prepared them before waking her, working in absolute silence while she slept. The efficiency of it, the careful planning, told her more about Caleb Mitchell than any words could. This was a man who had survived by being ready for the worst, who trusted his instincts enough to act on them without hesitation, who valued preparedness over hope. He helped her mount, steadied her until she found her balance with Grace in her arms. The baby was awake now, sensing the tension, but mercifully quiet. Catherine murmured soft words to her nonsense syllables meant only to soothe. They could not afford for Grace to cry, not now. Caleb swung onto his own horse, gestured for Catherine to follow. They moved away from the cabin at a walk heading north and up. Always up. Catherine understood the strategy even without explanation. The higher they went, the harder to follow. The higher they went, the fewer places their pursuers could corner them. Behind them, perhaps a mile distant, now she heard it. The sound that had woken Caleb. Horses. Men's voices calling to each other, careless and confident. They knew where the cabin was. They were coming. Caleb increased the pace to a trot, then a canter as the trail allowed. Catherine clung to her horse with her knees, both arms wrapped around Grace. The rhythm of the horse's gait threatened to jar the baby loose, but she held tight, trusting in strength born of desperation. They rode for an hour through darkness that slowly gave way to pre-dawn gray. The trail climbed steadily, switchbacking up a mountainside through dense forest. Catherine's arms ached. Her legs trembled with the effort of staying mounted. But she did not complain, did not ask to rest. Behind them, pursuit followed. That knowledge alone was enough to keep her moving. As the first rays of sun touched the peaks above them, Caleb finally drew rein. They had reached a small meadow, an alpine clearing, where wildflowers nodded in the morning breeze, and a stream sang its way downhill. He dismounted, came to help Catherine down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched ground. We'll rest here, Caleb said, already moving to the stream with canteens. 10 minutes. Water the horses, feed the baby. Catherine sank onto a fallen log, her whole body trembling with exhaustion. Grace was fussing now, hunger overcoming her earlier quiet. Caleb returned with fresh water and the flask of goat's milk, still cool from being carried in the mountain air. He poured some into a cup, tested the temperature, then handed it to Catherine. She fed Grace while Caleb tended the horses, both of them working in weary silence. The sun climbed higher, painting the meadow gold. It would have been beautiful under other circumstances. Peaceful, a place to rest and appreciate the majesty of creation. Instead, it was merely a brief pause in flight. How far? Catherine asked. 6 more miles to where we're going. Trail gets harder from here. Caleb scanned the forest behind them, eyes sharp for movement. They'll have reached the cabin by now. Found it empty. It'll take them time to pick up our trail in the dark, but they'll find it eventually. Who are they? Catherine already knew, but she needed to hear it confirmed. The men who had you before. led by a man named Jack Wilson. Caleb's jaw tightened. Black Jack, they call him, on account of the Confederate flag he wears in the darkness of his soul. The name meant nothing to Catherine, but the way Caleb said it spoke volumes. This was personal for him somehow, more than just a mountain man protecting a stranger. There was history here, old grudges, running deeper than today's trouble. You know him, Catherine said. Caleb nodded slowly. Knew him, long time ago, during the war. He paused, seemed to weigh how much to tell her. My unit captured him in Virginia, 64. He was running a ring trafficking women to Confederate officers. Deserter and criminal both. I testified at his court-martial. He got 10 years hard labor. Catherine felt pieces clicking into place. So this is revenge for you. Personal. For me, for the money you cost him for his pride. Caleb met her eyes. He's not the type to let things go. Never was. That's why I knew we had to run. But you can't run forever. No, Caleb agreed, but I can run long enough and far enough to make him give up. Men like Jack, they're bullies, prey on the weak, but they don't have much stomach for real hardship, real danger. We stay ahead of him long enough, he'll find easier targets. Catherine wanted to believe that, wanted to trust that eventually this nightmare would end, that she and Grace could find peace. But something in Caleb's voice suggested he did not entirely believe his own words. That he knew, as she was beginning to know, that some men never stopped hunting what they felt was owed to them. They remounted and pushed on. The trail grew steeper, narrower. In places it disappeared entirely, and Caleb had to dismount to lead the horses across bare rock faces where one misstep would mean a fatal fall. Catherine closed her eyes during these crossings, trusting her horse and Caleb's guidance, praying that Grace would remain still and quiet. By midday, they had climbed above the tree line into a world of bare rock and scrub vegetation. The air was thin, each breath requiring effort. Catherine's head began to ache. Grace fussed intermittently, uncomfortable with the altitude and the long hours of travel. But there was no choice except to continue. Caleb led them along the flank of a mountain, following a trail that might have been made by goats. Catherine could see for miles in every direction now. Behind them, far below, she caught a flash of movement. Riders, still following, still coming. They're persistent, Caleb muttered. Following her gaze, figured they'd give up by now. How many of four that I can see? Might be more out of sight. 4 armed men against 1. The mathematics of survival were not favorable. Catherine felt fear tighten around her chest, making the thin air feel even thinner. But alongside the fear came something else. Anger. She was tired of running. Tired of being hunted. Tired of men deciding her fate without her consent. What if we stopped running? The words came out before she had fully formed the thought. Caleb looked at her sharply. What if we faced them, but on our terms, not theirs? You're talking about a fight. His voice was flat, assessing. 4 armed men against 1 with you and a baby to protect. Those aren't good odds. Not a fight, Catherine said, her mind working through possibilities. A trap. They expect us to keep running to stay defensive. What if we gave them what they think they want, but made sure the cost was higher than they were willing to pay? Caleb studied her face, and Catherine saw surprise there. The frightened woman who had stood on the auction block was gone, replaced by someone who had found her own strength in the crucible of survival. Someone who was done being prey. You have an idea, he said, not a question. Catherine nodded, her plan taking shape as she spoke. They want me because I represent money to them, a debt to be collected. But what if collecting that debt became more expensive than the original amount? What if they had to choose between cutting their losses and risking everything? She outlined her thoughts while Caleb listened with growing admiration for her tactical thinking. It was dangerous requiring them to split up, requiring Catherine to expose herself to capture. But it offered something their previous plans had lacked, the possibility of ending the pursuit permanently rather than just postponing it. You understand what you're proposing? Caleb asked when she finished. If this goes wrong, you and Grace could end up in their hands with no way for me to help you. Catherine had already weighed the risks against the alternatives. If we keep running, they'll catch us eventually anyway. At least this way we choose the time and place. And if it works, we win our freedom completely instead of just buying time. Caleb was quiet for several minutes, turning her plan over in his mind, examining it from every angle. Finally, he nodded slowly. It could work, but it requires perfect timing and a lot of luck. If either of us makes a mistake, we both pay the price. Then we don't make mistakes. Something like a smile ghosted across Caleb's face. No, ma'am, I don't suppose we do. He urged his horse forward, and they continued climbing toward a destination Catherine could not yet see. But she felt something shift within her. For 3 weeks, she had been powerless at the mercy of men who saw her as property. Now, for the first time, she was taking control, making choices, fighting back. It felt right. It felt necessary. And if God judged her for choosing action over passive acceptance, well, she would face that judgment when it came. For now, she had a baby to protect and a life to defend. Everything else was secondary. The trail dipped between two massive rock formations and suddenly opened onto a sight that took Catherine's breath away. A hidden valley perfect as a jewel lay before them. It was circular, perhaps 300 yards across, surrounded on all sides by sheer cliff faces that rose 200 feet into the air. A stream ran through its center, feeding grass and wildflowers. An aspen grove clustered on the eastern side, their leaves shimmering gold and green in the afternoon sun. But the most remarkable feature was the entrance itself. A narrow gap in the cliffs, barely 10 feet wide and 30 feet long. A natural choke point that one man with a rifle could defend against a small army. This is it, Caleb said. My emergency sanctuary. Found it 5 years back, tracking a wounded elk. Never told anyone about it. Kept it for exactly this kind of situation. Catherine stared at the valley, understanding immediately why Caleb had led them here. It was defensible, easily provisioned from the stream and whatever game wandered through. And most importantly, it had only one way in or out. They could see their enemies coming long before those enemies could see them. It's perfect, she breathed. They rode into the valley and immediately set about making camp. Caleb constructed a lean-to shelter from fallen logs and pine boughs, working with practiced speed. Catherine helped where she could, gathering firewood and edible plants she recognized from her studies of frontier medicine. Grace played in the grass, nearby, crawling and babbling, delighted to be free of her confining blanket. By evening, they had established a basic camp. A fire burned in a carefully chosen spot where the smoke would dissipate before rising above the cliff tops. Caleb caught fish from the stream, and they ate fresh trout cooked over open flame. Simple food, but it tasted like heaven after weeks of deprivation. As darkness fell and Grace settled into sleep, Catherine and Caleb sat by the fire and refined their plan. He showed her where he would position himself on the cliff, on how she should place herself to draw the men into the open, what signals to use for timing. They went over it again and again until Catherine could recite it in her sleep. "You're sure about this?" Caleb asked as they finished their preparations. "Once we commit, there's no going back." "I'm sure," Catherine was surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I've spent 3 weeks running, 3 weeks afraid. I'm done with both. Tomorrow we end this one way or another." Caleb nodded, then said something that surprised her. "Your father would be proud. Dr. Hayes raised a fighter even if he disguised her in a nun's habit." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes at the mention of her father. Jonathan Hayes had been dead for 2 years now, taken by the same fever that ravaged so many in the crowded cities. He had been a good man, a man who believed in standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. What would he think of his daughter, now planning ambushes and preparing to use violence to defend herself? But she knew the answer. He would tell her that protecting the innocent was always justified, that Grace's life mattered more than abstract principles of nonviolence, that a nun's vows did not require her to stand passive while evil men did evil things. "He taught me to think," Catherine said quietly, "to use my mind as well as my hands. I wish he could have met you. I think you would have understood each other." "Union surgeon and Union soldier," Caleb agreed. "Yeah, we'd have found common ground." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn low. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called its voice lonely in the vastness of the mountains. Catherine thought about the strange path that had brought her to this moment. From Boston society to a convent in the wilderness. From a nun sworn to peace to a woman planning violence. From victim to strategist. Life, it seemed, delighted in ironic transformations. Morning came too soon and not soon enough. Catherine woke before dawn, her body tense with anticipation. Today would decide everything. Today they would either win their freedom or lose everything they had fought for. Caleb was already awake, checking his rifle, counting ammunition. He looked up when he saw her stirring. They'll be here by noon, maybe sooner. I saw their campfire last night, about 5 miles back. 5 mile. Close enough to reach the valley entrance in a few hours of steady riding. Close enough that there was no more time for second thoughts or changes of plan. Catherine fed Grace and held her close, memorizing the weight of the baby in her arms, the trust in those innocent eyes. Whatever happened today, Grace deserved to grow up free, deserved a life unburdened by the sins and stupidity of adults. That thought alone was enough to steel Catherine's resolve. I'm ready, she said. Caleb studied her face, then nodded. Remember, when they come you act scared but resigned, like you've accepted your fate. Draw them into the center of the valley. I'll take care of the rest. And if something goes wrong, then you run. Don't wait for me, don't look back. Take Grace and you run as hard and fast as you can. He handed her a small knife in a leather sheath. Last resort, use it if you have to. Catherine tucked the knife into her boot, feeling its weight settle against her leg. She had never used a weapon against another human being, had never imagined she would need to. But desperation made philosophers of us all, and she was desperate enough to do whatever was necessary. Caleb climbed to his position on the cliff face, moving with the agility of a mountain goat, despite the rifle and ammunition he carried. Catherine watched until he disappeared among the rocks, camouflaged so perfectly she could no longer see him, even knowing where to look. Then she settled near the stream, with Grace arranging herself to look vulnerable and defeated. The waiting was the hardest part. Every minute crawled by with agonizing slowness. Grace sensed her tension and fussed, requiring constant attention to keep quiet. Catherine sang to her old hymns from the convent, her voice barely above a whisper. The familiar words calmed them both. The sun climbed toward its zenith. Catherine's nerves stretched tighter with each passing minute. What if they did not come? What if they had given up after all? What if the whole plan was for nothing? Then she heard it. Horses, men's voices, coming closer. Catherine's heart began to race. She forced herself to remain still, to look defeated and alone. Grace cooed in her arms, oblivious to the danger. Catherine kissed the baby's forehead, whispered a prayer, and waited for her captors to arrive. But the men who emerged from the narrow gap were not Blackjack and his gang. They were miners, a dozen of them, led by a grizzled man whose face was weathered by years of hard living, but whose eyes held intelligence and something that looked like compassion. Hold there, the leader called out, raising a hand in a gesture of peace. We're not here to harm you, ma'am. Name's Samuel Patterson. We're from Blackwood Gulch. Catherine stared at them, her plans suddenly in ruins. What were miners doing here? How had they found the valley, and where was Black? Jack Patterson dismounted, approached slowly with his hands visible and empty of weapons. We heard about the auction, about Black Jack hunting you. Some of us didn't sit right with how that went down. A nun and a baby sold like cattle. What do you want? Catherine's voice came out steady despite her racing thoughts. We want to settle this legal, Patterson said. Miners' court, right here, right now. We'll hear both sides vote on whether you're Blackjack's property or a free woman. From her position on the cliff, Catherine heard the soft sound of Caleb repositioning himself, adjusting to this new development. She looked up, caught a barely visible signal. Wait, see where this goes. Why, Catherine asked Patterson, why do you care? Because law means something even out here. Maybe especially out here. Patterson gestured to the other miners. We make our own justice when we have to. Figure this situation calls for it. Before Catherine could respond, more riders emerged from the gap. Blackjack Wilson and 3 of his men, armed and dangerous. They pulled up short when they saw the miners, clearly not expecting an audience. Blackjack was exactly as Catherine had imagined from Caleb's description. Tall, scarred, wearing a Confederate flag bandana around his neck like a trophy from a war he had lost. His eyes were hard and calculating, the eyes of a man who had done terrible things and would do more without hesitation. What's this? Blackjack demanded, his hand moving toward his pistol. Patterson stepped between him and Catherine. Miners' court, Jack. We're settling this dispute proper. You claim the sister belongs to you. She says different. We'll hear both sides and vote. Blackjack's face darkened with anger. I don't need your permission to take what's mine. Maybe not, Patterson agreed mildly, but you're outnumbered 12-4. So you can participate in a fair hearing, or you can try to take her by force and see how that works out for you. The mathematics were clear. Blackjack was vicious, but not stupid. He could not win a fight against 12 armed miners, not without casualties he could not afford. His eyes swept the valley, calculating odds, looking for alternatives. Catherine saw the moment he decided to play along at least temporarily. Fine, he spat. Let's have your court, but when I win, she's mine free and clear. If you win, Patterson corrected, that's what a trial determines. The miners arranged themselves in a rough semicircle, creating a makeshift courtroom in the mountain meadow. Patterson appointed himself judge. The other 11 would serve as jury. Catherine found herself standing before them, still holding Grace, while Blackjack and his men watched from one side. Somewhere on the cliff above, invisible to everyone below, Caleb had a clear shot at all of them. Catherine took comfort in that and knowing she was not truly alone despite appearances. Jack Wilson, Patterson began, you claim Sister Catherine as your property. State your case. Blackjack stepped forward, producing a folded paper from his coat. Got it right here. Contract signed by Mother Superior Agnes of St. Mary's Mission. They owed me $200 for protection services. When they couldn't pay, they traded Sister Catherine to settle the debt. She agreed to the terms. I got witnesses. He called forward one of his men, a scarred individual, who confirmed the story with obvious pleasure. Catherine felt rage building in her chest. The contract was a forgery, had to be. Mother Agnes would never have agreed to such a thing. But proving it from here with no way to contact the mission would be impossible. Your turn, sister, Patterson said. Catherine stepped forward, still holding Grace. She had spent 8 years learning to speak with authority, to project calm confidence, even in difficult situations. She called on those skills now. Gentlemen, I won't insult your intelligence by claiming that paper is completely false. Something happened at the mission, but it wasn't a business transaction. She made her voice carry, made each word count. Mr. Wilson and his men attacked St. Mary's Mission 3 weeks ago. They kidnapped with 4 people. Hannah Miller, a young mother from a nearby homestead, Sister Margaret, baby Grace, and myself. She told them about the trade she had offered, about volunteering to take Hannah's place, about the 3 weeks of captivity and flight. As she spoke, she saw some of the miners' expressions change from skepticism to belief. I volunteered to be kidnapped instead of another woman, Catherine concluded. That doesn't make it legal. It makes it coercion. Would any of you sell your daughter for $200, your sister? The question hung in the air. Some of the miners shifted uncomfortably. Catherine pressed her advantage. And even if that contract were legitimate, which it is not, you cannot sell a human being. The war settled that question. Mr. Wilson knows this. He's counting on you not caring. Blackjack surged forward, anger overriding caution. You lying witch! You came willing. No one forced you into that wagon. I came to save Hannah Miller and her child from what you were threatening to do to them. Catherine shot back. That's not consent. That's survival. Patterson raised his hand, calling for order. We'll hear from Mr. Wilson about his side. Why were you at the mission? What were these protection services? For the first time, Blackjack hesitated. Catherine saw calculation in his eyes, saw him weighing truth against lies, deciding how much to reveal. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. All right, he said, his voice dropping the bluster. You want truth? Here's truth. He pulled a photograph from his pocket, held it up so the miners could see. A young girl, perhaps 9 years old, painfully thin and pale. My daughter, Emma. Consumption. Doctor in Denver says $500 might save her. Catherine saw several miners react to that, saw sympathy flash across their faces. Blackjack had found his angle, was playing it for all it was worth. I ain't got $500, he continued, voice breaking with what sounded like genuine emotion. Got no skills but soldiering and tracking. You men got minds, got futures. I got a dying girl in desperation. He looked directly at Catherine. So yeah, I took women to sell in Denver. Took this nun because she volunteered. Thought I was doing her a favor, taking her instead of that young mother. But she cost me $400 I needed for Emma. You ask why I'm here. I'm here because my daughter is dying, and this woman stole my chance to save her. The silence that followed was heavy. Catherine felt the mood in the clearing shift. Several miners were looking at her differently now, no longer seeing a pure victim, but a complicated situation where both parties had claims to sympathy. Patterson cleared his throat. Sister, you want to respond to that? Catherine looked at the photograph of Emma Wilson, felt genuine sorrow for the child's suffering. But sorrow did not excuse evil. Mr. Wilson, she said quietly, I am truly sorry about your daughter. I mean that sincerely. If I could heal her myself, I would. She paused, gathering her words. But your suffering doesn't justify creating more suffering. You could have come to the mission asking for help. We would have taken up a collection, done everything we could for Emma. Instead, you chose to steal, to kidnap, to sell human beings. Your daughter deserves better than money earned from trafficking innocent women. Blackjack had no response to that. He just stood there, the photograph still in his hand, looking defeated for the first time since Catherine had known him. Patterson called for deliberation. The 12 miners huddled together, their voices low but heated. Catherine could catch fragments of argument. Law is law. He's got papers. Papers are meaningless. She's a nun. But his daughter, that ain't our problem. The discussion went on for long minutes. Catherine held Grace close, the baby mercifully quiet, as if she understood the importance of this moment. Everything hung in the balance. Freedom or slavery. Life or living death. Finally, Patterson separated from the group. His face was grave. We've reached a decision, he announced, but it was close, real close. He looked at Catherine, then at Blackjack. All in favor of Sister Catherine being a free woman, raise your hands. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. She watched as hands went up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 hands. All in favor of Blackjack's claim being valid. 5 hands rose. 5 against 6. By a vote of 6 to 5, Patterson declared, this court rules that Sister Catherine Hayes is a free woman. Mr. Wilson's claim is denied. Catherine nearly collapsed with relief. 6 to 5. One vote. Her freedom had been decided by a single miner's conscience. It should have felt more substantial, more secure, but at least it was decided in her favor. Blackjack's face went purple with rage. This is horse shit I don't recognize, this kangaroo court. This ain't legal. It's as legal as your contract, Patterson said calmly. You had your hearing, you lost. Time to accept it and move on. The hell I will. Blackjack drew his pistol, the metallic click of the hammer loud in the mountain air. I'll take what's mine. His 3 men drew their weapons as well. Instantly, the 12 miners had rifles pointed at them. The valley filled with the sound of weapons being cocked, hammers being pulled back. 16 armed men all ready to kill. Baby Grace began to cry, the tension finally too much even for her infant instincts. The sound cut through the standoff like a knife, high and piercing and desperate. Then from the cliff face above, Caleb's rifle spoke. The bullet hit dirt 2 feet in front of Blackjack, spraying dust over his boots. Every head whipped up looking for the source. But Caleb was invisible among the rocks, his voice disembodied and terrifying. Drop your weapons. The command echoed off the valley walls, seeming to come from everywhere at once. I can see all of you. You can't see me. Next shot won't be a warning. Blackjack spun in circles, trying to locate the shooter. Mitchell, that's you, come down here and face me like a man. Another shot, this one even closer to Blackjack's feet. The man jumped back with a curse. I said drop them. Caleb's voice was ice cold. You've got 5 seconds. Then I start putting bullets in people. One of Blackjack's men, the one called Red, immediately threw down his pistol. I'm out, boss. This ain't worth dying for. Coward, Blackjack snarled. Smart, Red corrected, backing toward his horse. Good luck, Jack. Hope your daughter gets better. He mounted and rode out, not looking back. Another of Jack's men followed, leaving just Jack and 1 loyal follower against Caleb's invisible rifle and 12 miners with itchy trigger fingers. Last chance, Caleb called. Surrender or die. Your choice. Blackjack stood, frozen rage and desperation warring on his face. Catherine could see him calculating odds, looking for any advantage. But there was none. He was beaten, and he knew it. Slowly, his hand lowered. The pistol dropped to the dirt. Fine, he spat. You win. But I want you to know, Mitchell, my daughter might die because of this. You remember that. You remember you killed a little girl to save a nun. The words hit like physical blows. Catherine saw Caleb emerge from his hiding place, saw the pain flash across his face before he locked it away. That accusation, that specific cruelty, was calculated to wound, and it had found its mark. Caleb descended to the valley floor rifle, still ready, eyes never leaving Blackjack. He approached slowly, cautiously, knowing that desperate men were the most dangerous. "I'm not executing you, Jack," Caleb said quietly, "though God knows you deserve it for what you've done." "So what, you're just letting me go?" Blackjack's voice was bitter. "Out of the goodness of your heart." Caleb reached into his coat, pulled out a leather pouch. He counted out coins, gold pieces that glinted in the afternoon sun. Catherine watched in shock as he extended them toward Blackjack. $100, Caleb said, "for Emma, for the doctor in Denver." Blackjack stared at the money as if it were a snake. "What? Your daughter's innocent. She doesn't deserve to die because her father's a bastard." Caleb's voice was hard. "Take it. Get her help. But if I ever see you again, if you come anywhere near Catherine or Grace, I will kill you." "That's not a threat. That's a promise," of the Blackjack took the money with shaking hands, unable to speak. He looked from the coins to Caleb's face, searching for the trick, the trap. But there was none. Just a man who had lost his own child, offering money to save another, even the child of his enemy. "I don't understand you people," Blackjack finally whispered. Catherine stepped forward, still holding Grace. "That's because you stopped believing anyone could be good, Mr. Wilson. You let the war and your losses turn you into something you weren't meant to be. But it's not too late. You can still choose differently." Blackjack helped his remaining man onto a horse, then mounted his own. He looked down at Catherine and Caleb, his scarred face working through emotions too complex to name. "I hope to God you're right, sister," he said. "For Emma's sake, I hope you're right." Then he was gone, riding out through the narrow gap with his last loyal follower. The sound of hoofbeats faded into distance, and finally, the valley was quiet except for the stream and the wind and Grace's diminishing cries. Catherine sank to her knees, the adrenaline draining from her body all at once. She had been so afraid, so certain that today would end in blood and death. But they had won. Not through violence, though violence had been prepared. Through law, through mercy, through the complicated arithmetic of human conscience. Caleb knelt beside her, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "You all right?" "I cut a man." Catherine whispered, the reality of what she had done finally hitting her. "I lied in court. I used a baby as bait. I violated every vow I ever took." "You protected her," Caleb said firmly. "You did what needed doing. I don't know who I am anymore. You're someone who's survived. That's enough for today." The miners were preparing to leave, packing up their impromptu court, satisfied that justice had been done according to their lights. Patterson approached Catherine and Caleb, extending his hand. "You two need anything, you come to Blackwood Gulch," he said. "Far as we're concerned, you're family now. Anyone gives you trouble, they answer to all of us." Caleb shook his hand. "Appreciate it, Patterson, more than you know." "Just doing what's right." Patterson tipped his hat to Catherine. "Ma'am, you're a brave woman. Your vows or not, you're welcome in our town anytime." They rode out, leaving Catherine and Caleb alone with Grace in the hidden valley. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. It was beautiful, peaceful, safe at least for now. Catherine sat by the stream, letting Grace play in the shallow water under her watchful eye. Caleb built up the fire, started preparing a simple meal. They moved around each other in comfortable silence. Two people who had been through fire together and emerged changed. As darkness fell and Grace settled into sleep, Catherine found herself asking the question that had been building since the moment Caleb had given Blackjack that money. Why did you do it? Give him money for his daughter after everything he did? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was raw with old pain. "Because I couldn't save my son," he said. "Couldn't save Mary. Couldn't do a damn thing except watch them die. But maybe I could save Emma Wilson. Maybe one child doesn't have to die because adults are cruel or stupid or desperate." He looked at Catherine then, and she saw tears tracking through the dust on his face. "I know what it's like to lose a child. I wouldn't wish that on anyone, not even Black Jack. So yeah, I gave him the money. Because Emma deserves a chance, same as Grace, same as Samuel." Catherine moved to sit beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You're a good man, Caleb Mitchell. Better than you know. I'm a man who made it through today, Caleb replied. That's all I can manage right now. They sat together in silence, watching the fire burn low, listening to Grace's peaceful breathing. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight they had won. Tonight they were free. And sometimes in a harsh world, that was miracle enough. The aftermath of the trial settled over the hidden valley like dust after a windstorm. The miners had departed. Blackjack and his men had ridden away carrying with them both defeat and unexpected mercy. The sun continued its arc across the sky, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if the world had not just tilted on its axis for three people trying to survive in the wilderness. Catherine sat by the stream, Grace in her arms, and felt something inside her begin to crack. Not break exactly, more like the sound of ice fracturing in spring, the first sign that something frozen was beginning to thaw. She had held herself together through 3 weeks of terror, through capture and auction and flight. She had remained strong through the trial, through the standoff, through watching Caleb offer mercy to a man who deserved none. But now, in the quiet aftermath, with safety finally real instead of hoped for, she found herself trembling. Her hands shook as she held Grace. Her breath came in short gasps. The rosary beads wrapped around her wrist felt like shackles instead of comfort. Caleb noticed. He always noticed. He knelt beside her, careful not to touch, respecting the boundaries that still existed between them, despite everything they had been through together. Sister, his voice was gentle. You did good today. I cut a man. Catherine's voice sounded hollow to her own ears. I stood in front of that court and lied. I used this innocent baby as bait. I watched you give money to save a child while holding a rifle ready to kill her father. She looked up at him, eyes swimming with tears. What kind of nun does these things? The kind who protects the helpless. Caleb settled onto the ground beside her, close enough for support but not so close as to crowd. The kind who understands that sometimes faith requires action, not just prayer. I violated every vow I took. Catherine felt the words spilling out, confession to a man who was not a priest, but who somehow felt safer to tell than any confessor behind a screen. Poverty, chastity, obedience, and today nonviolence. I've broken them all. You kept the one that matters most, Caleb said quietly. Love thy neighbor, protect the innocent. You loved Grace enough to trade your freedom for hers. You loved Hannah enough to volunteer for hell. That's more Christian than in most Christians I've met. Catherine wanted to believe him, wanted to accept that what she had done was justified, even necessary. But 8 years of convent training whispered differently in her mind. 8 years of being told that a good woman submitted, endured, turned the other cheek no matter what. Grace stirred in her arms, making small, contented sounds. The baby had no idea how close they had all come to disaster. No concept of the moral gymnastics Catherine was performing to justify her actions. Grace just knew she was fed and warm and held by someone who loved her. Simple infant math that reduced the world to immediate needs being met. Can we stay here? Catherine asked suddenly. In this valley, just for a while. Caleb considered the question seriously, his eyes scanning the cliffs and stream and meadowgrass. Long as you need, I've got supplies cached nearby. Game comes through regular. Water's good. We could last out the summer easy, maybe longer. I don't know where else to go. The admission cost Catherine something. The mission is too dangerous. Blackjack might keep his word, but his reputation won't. Other men will come looking for the nun who fought back. And I can't. She paused, swallowed hard. I can't face Mother Agnes right now. Can't explain what I've become. You haven't become anything except braver, Caleb said. But his tone made it clear he would not push. If she needed time in this hidden place to sort through her shattered certainties, he would give her that time. They spent the evening in quiet companionship, cooking a simple meal, tending to Grace, performing the small rituals of survival that had become familiar over the past days. As darkness fell and Grace slept in the makeshift cradle Caleb had constructed from his coat, in a wooden box, Catherine found herself staring into the fire and trying to imagine a future. What did that future look like? She was no longer truly a nun, not in any way that mattered. She had abandoned her order, broken her vows, chosen violence over peace. But she was not quite a civilian either. Could not simply shed 8 years of religious life like an outgrown coat. The prayers still came automatically. The impulse towards service still pulled at her. The sense of being set apart, consecrated to something larger than herself, that remained even when the practical expressions of it had been stripped away. "What do you want?" Caleb asked, as if reading her thoughts. "For yourself and Grace. When this is all settled." "I don't know." Catherine pulled her borrowed shirt tighter around her shoulders. The nights were cold at this altitude, even in summer. "I wanted to serve God. Thought I was doing that at the mission. But maybe I was just hiding. Running from life because it hurt too much after Thomas died." She had not spoken Thomas's name aloud in years. It felt strange on her tongue, like a word from a foreign language, half forgotten. Thomas Brennan, who had loved books and justice and her in that order. Who had died because another man's carelessness put a bullet through his chest while he was simply walking in the woods. "Tell me about him," Caleb said. So Catherine did. She told him about Boston, about her father's medical practice and the long nights helping him tend to patients. About meeting Thomas at a lecture on constitutional law, about the slow courtship conducted through books loaned and discussed, about the engagement, the plans they had made, the life that was supposed to unfold, and about the morning she had learned he was dead. How something in her had simply closed down, decided that if loving meant losing, then she would love nothing and no one ever again. How the convent had seemed like refuge, like a place where she could be useful without being vulnerable. "But Grace changed that," Catherine said softly. "The moment I held her, the moment I decided to trade my freedom for hers, I was vulnerable again. I loved her, still love her, and that terrifies me more than blackjack ever could." Caleb understood. She could see it in his eyes. He had loved and lost too, had built walls around his heart and chosen isolation over risk. And then on a dusty street in Blackwood Gulch, he had seen a woman and child being sold, and those walls had proven less solid than he thought. "Love makes cowards of us all," Caleb said quietly. "Makes us afraid of losing what we found. But the alternative is worse. Living without love, that's not living at all. That's just existing, breathing in and out and waiting to die." His words echoed what Mary had said her last request, that he live instead of merely survive. Catherine wondered if Mary Mitchell had known what she was asking. If she had understood that living meant risking your heart again, meant opening yourself to the possibility of loss all over again. The fire burned low. The stars emerged one by one overhead, so many and so bright in the mountain darkness that Catherine felt dizzy looking at them. Grace slept on, peaceful and trusting, and Catherine made a decision. "I'm going to leave the order," she said. "Formally, I'll write to Mother Agnes, explain what happened, ask to be released from my vows." Caleb nodded slowly. "That's a big step." "It's the honest step." Catherine felt certainty settling into her bones. "Okay, yeah, I can't go back to being Sister Catherine. That woman died somewhere between the mission and here. But I can be Catherine Hayes again, can be Grace's mother properly, can figure out who I'm meant to be now. And if Mother Agnes refuses, if she says your vows are eternal, then I'll know I made them to the wrong authority." Catherine looked at Grace, at the rise and fall of her small chest. "I believe in God, truly, but I also believe God wants me to protect this child more than he wants me to wear a habit and recite prayers. If I'm wrong, I'll face that judgment eventually. But for now, I choose Grace. I choose life." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, a warming that had nothing to do with the dying fire. "You're a remarkable woman, Catherine Hayes." It was the first time he had used her Christian name without the sister prefix. The sound of it, simple and human, made Catherine's breath catch. She was Catherine again. Not Sister Catherine, just Catherine. A woman trying to figure out how to live after the world had turned upside down. The days that followed established a routine. Caleb built a proper shelter, not just a lean-to, but a sturdy structure with walls and a roof that would keep out rain. Catherine helped where she could, learning the rhythms of frontier construction. They fell into an easy partnership, each contributing skills the other lacked. Catherine foraged for edible plants and herbs, her medical training making her confident in identifying what was safe to eat. She caught fish in the stream, using techniques she barely remembered her father teaching her as a child. She tended Grace with a combination of medical knowledge and simple trial and error that every new mother employed. Caleb hunted, bringing back deer and elk that he butchered with efficient precision. He maintained their weapons, kept the fire going, stood watch during the nights when Catherine's nightmares woke her gasping. He carved toys for Grace from scrap wood, his large hands surprisingly delicate when working on small things. And every evening after Grace was asleep, Caleb taught Catherine to read better. Not the basic literacy she already possessed, but the deeper comprehension of the books he had accumulated over years of solitary living. Shakespeare and Cervantes and the Bible read not as scripture, but as literature. Catherine in turn taught him anatomy and medicine from the medical texts her father had sent her before his death. September gave way to October. The aspens turned gold, then shed their leaves in fluttering cascades. Catherine still wore her torn habit during the day, having no other clothes, but Caleb's shirt had become a constant layer against the increasing cold. Grace grew stronger, healthier, her cheeks filling out from regular food and her laughter ringing through the valley. In November came the first real snow. Catherine woke one morning to find the valley transformed, everything white and pristine and achingly beautiful. Grace took her first steps that day, wobbling between Catherine and Caleb, with determination that ended in a tumbling fall and delighted giggles. They both cried, watching her tears of joy mixed with memory of children who had not lived to walk. December brought more snow, enough to effectively trap them in the valley. The narrow entrance became nearly impassable, blocked by drifts higher than a man's head. Caleb had prepared for this, stockpiling food and firewood. They were safe, warm, and well provided for. But the isolation was complete. They celebrated what Catherine estimated was Grace's first birthday with a cake made from hoarded sugar and dried fruit. Caleb had carved a toy horse remarkably detailed that Grace clutched with possessive delight. It was a small celebration, just the three of them in their shelter while snow fell outside. But it felt like family in a way that made Catherine's chest ache with complicated emotions. The winter closeness changed things between her and Caleb. Forced proximity in the small shelter meant they could not avoid each other, could not maintain the careful distance they had preserved in warmer months. Catherine grew accustomed to falling asleep to the sound of Caleb's breathing, to waking and finding him already up and building the fire. She learned the rhythms of his movements, the small sounds that meant he was troubled or content or simply tired. And she began to notice other things. The way his beard was shot through with gray she had not seen before. The scars on his hands from years of hard living. The rare smile that transformed his normally serious face. The gentleness with which he handled Grace as if she were made of spun glass. On Christmas Eve, Catherine tried to pray the rosary. The beads moved through her fingers with familiar smoothness, worn by 8 years of daily use. But the words would not come. Her mouth formed them, but her heart remained silent. The prayers felt like reciting in a language she had once known, but had forgotten the meaning of. Caleb watched her struggle from across the shelter. Finally, he asked quietly, "What's wrong?" "I can't feel it anymore." Catherine's voice broke. "God, my vows, the calling I was so certain of. All I feel is here, this place, you, Grace. Is that wrong? Is that a sin? What do you want to feel?" The question caught Catherine off guard. She had spent so many years trying to feel what she was supposed to feel, trying to manufacture devotion and holy joy, when what she actually felt was grief and loneliness and a terrible aching emptiness. But what did she actually want? "I want to be Grace's mother," she said slowly, feeling her way through the truth. Not just her protector or her nurse, her mother. "I want to build something here, something real and lasting. I want—" She paused, afraid to speak the next words. "I want to stop running from life. Want to choose it even though it might hurt." "That sounds like a good wanting to me," Caleb said. In January, Catherine finally wrote the letter. It took her 3 days to compose it, working through multiple drafts on precious paper Caleb had in his supplies. Each version tried to explain the inexplicable to justify the unjustifiable. Finally, she settled on simple honesty. "Dearest Mother Agnes," she wrote, "I must inform you of my decision to leave the order. I cannot claim my vows were coerced. They were given freely at a time when I believed I understood what I was choosing. But I have found a different calling now. Motherhood, partnership, life itself. I am caring for an orphan child who needs me in ways the mission never did. And I have found a good man who showed me what sacrifice truly means. I remain devoted to God and to serving others, but I can no longer serve within the confines of the convent. Please pray for me as I will pray for you. Your sister in Christ, Catherine Hayes." Reading it back, Catherine realized she had not asked for permission or forgiveness. She had simply stated a decision already made. The vows she had taken could not be untaken, perhaps, but they could be set aside, could be acknowledged as choices made by a younger, more frightened version of herself who no longer existed. Caleb rode to Blackwood Gulch when the snow cleared enough in February, carrying the letter and returning with supplies. He also brought back a small wooden box that he would not let Catherine see, setting it aside with a mysterious smile that she found both frustrating and charming. Spring came late to the high country, but it came. Snow melted in rushing torrents. Wildflowers pushed through mud. Grace, now 16 months old, walked with increasing confidence and had begun to string words together into simple sentences. Mama for Catherine, Papa for Caleb. More when she wanted food. No when she wanted to assert her independence. That casual Papa stabbed through Catherine's heart every time Grace said it. The baby had no memory of her biological parents, whoever they had been. Hannah had given birth to her, but Catherine had raised her. And Caleb, despite his initial distance, had become the only father figure Grace would ever know. One evening in April, after Grace had fallen asleep, Caleb cleared his throat in the way that meant he had something difficult to say. Catherine looked up from the mending she was doing, waiting. I need to ask you something, he said. Catherine's heart began to beat faster. She set down her needle. Yes, Caleb looked nervous, an expression so foreign on his usually composed face that Catherine almost laughed. He fumbled in his pocket, pulled out the small wooden box he had brought from town months ago. These 6 months, he began, then stopped, started again. Best 6 months I've had since Mary died. Maybe best of my life, counting everything. And Grace, she needs a family, a real family. Not just people taking care of her, but people who choose to be her parents, legal and proper. He opened the box. Inside lay a simple gold band, worn smooth by years of wear. Mary's ring. Catherine recognized it for what it was, felt tears prick her eyes. I don't have pretty words, Caleb continued. Never been good at speeches. But I've come to, that is, he took a breath, tried again. I love you, Catherine Hayes. Love you and Grace both. And I'm asking if you'll marry me. Be Grace's mother by law. Be my wife. Build this life together, proper, not just surviving, but actually living. Catherine's hands were shaking. She reached out to touch the ring, felt the warmth of gold that had encircled another woman's finger for years. This was Mary's. She'd want you to have it, Caleb said with certainty. She told me to live. Think she'd approve of me choosing you. Yes, the word came out before Catherine had consciously decided to speak. But it was right, felt right in her bones, in her heart, in every part of her that had been frozen for 8 years and was finally thawing. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to all of it. Caleb's face transformed with a smile of such pure joy that Catherine felt her own tears spill over. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if Mary Mitchell had reached across death to give her blessing to this new life. They kissed for the first time then. Gentle and tentative at first, then deeper as 8 years of Catherine's loneliness and 2 years of Caleb's grief poured into that connection. It was not their first touch. They had worked side by side for months, their hands brushing, their shoulders bumping. But this was different. This was choice. This was promise. Grace woke up crying, as babies inevitably did at the worst possible moments. They broke apart laughing, both moving to comfort her. Catherine lifted the baby while Caleb lit a candle. Grace looked at them with sleepy confusion, then smiled and said, Mama, Papa, love. 3 words that contained entire universes. Love. The thing Catherine had run from for 8 years. The thing Caleb had thought died with his family. The thing Grace had somehow taught them both to risk again. They were married in Blackwood Gulch on a bright June morning. Patterson gave Catherine away, standing in for the father she had lost. The miners who had served as her jury attended dressed in their Sunday best, their rough faces split with genuine smiles. Reverend Thomas, the circuit preacher, performed the ceremony in the small wooden church. Catherine wore a simple dress borrowed from Patterson's daughter, her hair uncovered for the first time in 8 years. She felt strange without the habit, exposed and vulnerable, but also free. The weight she had carried for so long, the identity she had clung to, was finally set aside. Grace served as flower girl, toddling down the aisle, scattering wildflowers with more enthusiasm than accuracy. The miners laughed indulgently. This was their doing after all. They had voted for Catherine's freedom. Now they got to see her choose her own happiness. The vows were traditional, simple words that bound lives together. Catherine spoke them clearly, no hesitation or doubt. I, Catherine Hayes, take you, Caleb Mitchell, to be my husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. Caleb's voice was rougher emotion making it catch. I, Caleb Mitchell, take you, Catherine Hayes, to be my wife. I promise to protect you and Grace, to build a life worthy of your courage, to honor the sacrifice you made and the woman you've become. The ring slid onto her finger, Mary's ring, claiming her hand, as Caleb's ring had never been able to. Catherine felt the circle of gold like a brand marking her as chosen, as wanted, as loved. The reception was held outside the church, the miners breaking out bottles of whiskey and someone producing a fiddle. Catherine danced with Caleb, awkward and laughing, neither of them skilled, but both trying. Grace danced too, spinning in circles until she fell down dizzy and delighted. Then as the celebration reached its peak, a figure rode up the street, clean sober, different from the last time Catherine had seen him. But she recognized him instantly. Black Jack Wilson. The laughter died. Hands moved toward weapons. Caleb stepped in front of Catherine, his body a shield, but Jack raised his hands high, showing them empty. I'm not here for trouble, he called out. Just came to say something I should have said months ago. He dismounted slowly, keeping his movements careful and unthreatening. As he approached, Catherine saw how much he had changed. The hardness in his eyes had softened. The swagger was gone. He looked like a man who had been broken down and rebuilt into something different. I came to say thank you, Jack said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. He pulled a photograph from his pocket, held it up. Emma, she's alive, healthy. That $100 got her to the doctor in time. He saved her. The photograph showed a girl of perhaps 10, smiling and robust. The difference from the pale, sickly child in the earlier photo was startling. Jack's hands shook as he held it. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. He continued, looking between Catherine and Caleb. No, I did terrible things, hurt people who didn't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that because of you, because of your mercy, my daughter lives. And I'm trying to be the father she deserves, working honest now. Freight wagons, it's hard, but it's clean. Catherine studied his face, searching for deception or hidden agenda, but she saw only sincerity and a desperate need to make amends. She stepped forward past Caleb's protective presence. I'm glad Emma is well, she said quietly. She was always innocent in this, always deserved to live. More than I deserved her too, Jack agreed. His eyes were wet. I just needed you to know, needed to say it proper. Thank you for saving my daughter. He pulled out an envelope, extended it toward Caleb. And this, it's yours by right. The money you paid at that auction, $200. I've been saving it up, working extra. It's your wedding gift, I suppose. Return of what you spent to save the sister here. Caleb started to refuse, but Jack pressed it into his hands. Please, I can't move forward carrying this debt. Can't be the man Emma needs if I'm still holding stolen money. Catherine saw Caleb wavering, saw the conflict in his face. Then she had an idea, a way to turn this full circle into something good. We'll take it, she said, but not for ourselves. We'll use it to build a school. For children like Grace, children who need education and care. And we'll name it after Emma, the Emma Wilson Memorial School. Jack's face crumpled. He made a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. You people, you're too good for this world. Too damn good. We're just people trying to be better than our worst moments, Catherine said. Same as you're doing now. Jack left soon after, riding away with his head high for the first time in Catherine's memory. The celebration resumed, quieter now, but no less genuine. Catherine leaned against Caleb, his arm around her waist, and watched their wedding guests dance and drink and laugh. Did we do the right thing, she asked, forgiving him, taking his money for a school? I think, Caleb said slowly, that mercy is always the right thing when you can afford it. And we can afford it now. We're safe, we're free, we can afford to give others the same chance we got. The party continued until sunset painted the mountains in shades of fire. Then, as married couples had done since time immemorial, Catherine and Caleb left for their home. Not the hidden valley, which would always hold special meaning, but was too remote for permanent living. But a cabin Caleb had been building through spring located in a meadow halfway between the valley and Blackwood Gulch. That first night as husband and wife passed in tenderness and discovery. They loved each other with the cautious wonder of people who had thought they would never love again. Catherine shed her last identity as Sister Catherine and became fully Catherine Mitchell, wife and mother and woman, choosing life despite its risks. 2 years passed. Time that should have moved slowly, but instead rushed past in a blur of seasons and small moments that accumulated into a life. By June of 1880, the Mitchell homestead had grown from a single cabin to a compound that showed every evidence of permanence. The original cabin had been expanded to 3 rooms, plus a loft where Grace now slept. A barn housed their growing collection of animals, 3 goats and a dozen chickens, and 2 cows purchased with money earned from Caleb's hunting and trapping. The garden plot had tripled in size, producing enough vegetables to trade in town for other necessities. And true to their promise, a small schoolhouse stood at the edge of the property. The Emma Wilson Memorial School, its sign hand carved by Caleb and painted by Catherine. It served 8 children from surrounding homesteads, taught 3 days a week by Catherine, using methods her father had taught her and texts begged or borrowed from anyone who had them. On a warm June afternoon, Catherine sat on the porch of their home, one hand resting on her swollen belly. 7 months pregnant, her body awkward and uncomfortable, but her heart fuller than she had ever thought possible. Caleb was in the barn, Grace toddling after him, chattering in the way of 2.5-year-olds who had recently discovered the power of language. Catherine watched them together, her husband and her daughter, their heads bent over some project only they understood. Grace's hair was darker now, brown like Catherine's own. Her eyes were blue, origin unknown, legacy of parents she would never know. But her laugh was pure joy, uninhibited and free. Hoofbeats drew Catherine's attention. Visitors unusual out here, but not unheard of. She stood carefully, shading her eyes against the sun. 2 horses, a man and a woman. As they drew closer, Catherine's breath caught. Hannah Miller. Older, harder, but unmistakably the woman Catherine had traded her freedom to save. Hannah dismounted before her horse had fully stopped, nearly running to Catherine. Sister Catherine Patterson told me where to find you, told me everything about the trial and what you did, and I had to see Grace. Not sister anymore, Catherine said gently. Just Catherine now, Catherine Mitchell. Hannah's eyes went to Catherine's belly, understanding dawning. You're married. You left the order. Because of Grace. Because of a lot of things, Catherine corrected. But yes, partly because of Grace. Come sit. You must be exhausted from riding. They settled on the porch while Hannah's husband James tended the horses with Caleb's help. Grace had emerged from the barn at the sound of voices, curious about the strangers. Is that her? Hannah's voice shook. Is that my Grace? Catherine felt her heart clench. She had known this moment might come, eventually had tried to prepare for it. But how did you prepare to possibly lose your child to the woman who had given birth to her? Grace, Catherine called. Come meet someone. The little girl toddled over, then grew shy and hid behind Catherine's skirts. Hannah knelt down, tears streaming down her face. Hello, Grace. I'm someone who knew you when you were very tiny. Do you remember me? Grace peeked out, studied Hannah with a child's frank assessment. Then she shook her head and said clearly, Mama here. She patted Catherine's leg possessively. The words hit Hannah like a physical blow. Catherine saw her flinch, saw grief and acceptance war on her face. Finally, Hannah looked up at Catherine. She doesn't know me. She was only 8 months when we were taken, Catherine said gently. She has no memory of before. Hannah nodded, wiping her eyes. I didn't come to take her. I want you to know that. I came because I needed to see that she was all right, that she was happy, that my sacrifice giving her up to save us both led to something good. She's very happy, Catherine assured her. Loved and safe and growing like a weed. Caleb is a wonderful father, better than most men who share blood with their children. And you, oh? Hannah looked at Catherine's belly. You're happy too. This is what you wanted. Catherine thought about the question seriously. Had she wanted this, if asked 8 years ago or even 2 years ago, would she have chosen this life? A mountain cabin, a husband who spoke more to horses than people, a daughter not of her body, a second child on the way. I'm happier than I ever thought possible, Catherine said honestly. I spent 8 years hiding in a convent running from life because it hurt. But Grace and Caleb, they taught me that the pain is worth it, that love is worth the risk of loss. Hannah reached out and squeezed Catherine's hand. Thank you for saving her, for raising her, for being the mother I couldn't be. You could visit, Catherine offered. If you wanted, you and James, Grace should know where she came from, should know that her mother loved her enough to let her go. The adults' arrangement was made. Hannah and James would visit twice a year, would be aunt and uncle in Grace's life rather than parents. It was not perfect. It meant Grace would grow up with questions about her origins. But it was honest. It acknowledged the complicated truth that sometimes biology and motherhood were different things. That evening, after Hannah and James had departed and Grace had been put to bed, Catherine sat on the porch with Caleb and felt peace settle into her bones. The mountains rose around them, eternal and uncaring. Stars emerged one by one overhead. Somewhere a coyote called and another answered. Do you ever regret it? Caleb asked. The $200, all the trouble I brought into your life. Catherine laughed, the sound genuine and free. Every day I thank God you were foolish enough to spend a fortune on a nun and a baby. Best $200 ever wasted. Not wasted, Caleb corrected. He placed his hand over hers, over Mary's ring that had become Catherine's ring, over the life they had built together. Best $200 I ever invested. Inside the cabin, Grace stirred and called out, not crying, just checking that her parents were nearby. Catherine called back that they were here, that she was safe. The small voice settled back into sleep. Catherine leaned against Caleb's shoulder, his arm coming around to support her weight. The baby in her belly kicked strong and insistent. Their biological child conceived in love rather than duty. A second chance for Caleb to be a father. A first chance for Catherine to experience pregnancy and birth. What should we name him? Catherine asked. Or her? If it's a boy, Samuel, Caleb said without hesitation. After my son, give him a chance to live through another child bearing his name. And if it's a girl, Mary, Caleb said, after my wife who told me to live, who would have loved you, I think, would have approved of this whole mad situation. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes, not of sadness, but of gratitude. Gratitude that she had been foolish enough to trade herself for Hannah, that Caleb had been foolish enough to bid $200, that Grace had been innocent enough to need saving, that all their foolishness and desperation and courage had led to this moment on this porch under these stars. I never told you, Catherine said quietly, about why I became a nun, about Thomas. You don't have to. I want to. And she did. Wanted Caleb to know all of her, even the parts she had hidden for so long. So she told him about Thomas Brennan, about young love and sudden death, about choosing the convent because it felt like the only way to survive grief without being consumed by it. I thought I was giving my life to she concluded. But really, I was just running away from the possibility of loss. I couldn't lose what I never allowed myself to have. And now, Caleb asked, now I know that loss is the price of love, and I'm willing to pay it. Would rather love and lose than never love at all. She looked up at him, this quiet man who had saved her by accident and loved her on purpose. You taught me that, you and Grace both. They sat in silence as night deepened around them. The baby kicked again, insistent. Grace slept safe in her bed. The animals settled in the barn. The garden grew in the dark roots, pushing deeper into mountain soil. Life continued its eternal cycle of growth and change and new beginnings. Catherine thought about the auction block that had started this all, about standing there in torn habit with a baby in her arms, terrified and alone, about the voice that had called out $200 and changed 3 lives forever. She thought about Black Jack Wilson working honest, now trying to be worthy of his daughter's second chance, about Hannah Miller learning to let go of what she had lost so she could build something new, about Mother Agnes back at the mission, who had surely received Catherine's letter by now and was either praying for her soul or celebrating her freedom. And she thought about Caleb, who had lost everything and chosen to save a stranger anyway, who had bought her freedom and then given her choice, who loved her not despite her brokenness, but because he understood what it meant to be broken and rebuild yourself into something new. Worth it, Catherine said suddenly. What is all of it? The kidnapping, the auction, the running, all the fear and pain and uncertainty. Worth it because it led here, to this, to us. Caleb pulled her closer, his hand splaying across her pregnant belly. To us, he agreed. Inside, Grace began to cry in earnest now, a bad dream or simple need for reassurance. They rose together, moved as one into the cabin to comfort their daughter. This was their life now. Not perfect, not easy, but theirs. Chosen and built and defended with everything they had. Catherine lifted Grace from her bed, rocked her gently. Caleb stood beside them, his hand on Catherine's shoulder, his presence solid and steadying. Grace settled, quickly reassured by their closeness. She blinked sleepy eyes at them. Mama, Papa, baby. 3 words that contained their entire world. Catherine kissed Grace's forehead, passed her to Caleb for his own goodnight kiss. They tucked her back into bed together, both leaning over the small form to tuck blankets and smooth hair. As they returned to their own bed, Catherine felt the weight of contentment settle over her like those blankets. She had been Sister Catherine, sworn to celibacy and service. She had been Catherine, the captive property, to be bought and sold. She had been Catherine, a first fighter standing in a meadow with a knife in her boot, ready to defend the innocent. Now she was simply Catherine Mitchell, wife, mother, teacher, woman who had chosen life over fear, love over safety, risk over certainty. She fell asleep in her husband's arms, their unborn child moving between them, their daughter breathing softly in the next room. The mountains stood watch over them all, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and in a cabin built by hand and hope, a family slept. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Gardens to tend, and animals to feed, and lessons to teach, and a baby's imminent arrival. But tonight there was only peace, only love, only the miracle of 3 people who had found each other against all odds and chosen to build something lasting. Catherine's last thought before sleep claimed her was a prayer. Not the rote words of her convent years, but something simpler and truer. Thank you for second chances, for impossible mercy, for a man who paid $200 and changed everything, for a baby who taught me to be brave, for this life I never imagined, but cannot imagine living without. Thank you. The mountains held their silence. The stars gave no answer. But in that silence, in that vast indifferent sky, Catherine found something she had been searching for since Thomas Brennan died 10 years before. She found home.